The tide leaves things on the beach at Orcas Island that the mainland never sees. Driftwood shaped by years of open Pacific, kelp thick as rope, the occasional lost buoy still wearing its number. And once, on a gray November morning that was just beginning to separate itself from the night, a black dog the size of a small bear lying in the wet sand at the waterline, alive, alone, and breathing with the heavy, deliberate rhythm of something that had used everything it had to reach the shore. Vincent Nguyen found her at 6 in the morning because 6 in the morning was when he walked the beach, not from habit originally, but from the understanding, arrived at gradually over 3 years of island life, that the hour before the ferry ran and the shops opened, and the other 1,200 residents of Orcas Island began their day, was the only hour that belonged entirely to him, and that he needed it not for peace, because peace was not reliably available, but for the practice of being somewhere without needing the somewhere to be anything other than what it was. The island at that hour was gray water and pale sky, and the sound of the water on the stones, and that was enough, most mornings, to carry him into the day. He saw her from 100 yards out and thought at first she was a seal, which the island had many of, and then thought she was a piece of dark driftwood, which the island had more of, and then understood what she was and covered the remaining distance faster than he had moved toward anything in 3 years. If this story finds you tonight, tell us in the comments which city you are watching from, and subscribe to this channel before we go further, because what came in with the tide that November morning on Orcas Island was the beginning of something that neither Vincent, nor the dog, nor the island had arranged. And what it led to was the kind of thing that makes a person understand, finally, what they have been doing in a place and why the place was the right one. Vincent Nguyen was 47 years old and had come to Orcas Island the way certain people come to islands, which is by needing something the mainland was not providing and being willing to accept the inconvenience of water between themselves and everything else. He was lean and not tall, with dark hair gone silver at the temples, and a face that people on the island had initially read as guarded and had gradually revised to careful, which was more accurate and more respectful. His family had come from Vietnam in 1979 when Vincent was 3 years old, part of the second wave of boat people, and had settled in the fishing community of Astoria, Oregon, where his father had found work in the canneries and his mother had found work in a restaurant, and both of them had worked with the specific, undemonstrative intensity of people who have been given something they intend to honor. Vincent had grown up watching his parents give the country everything they had, and at 18 he had joined the Navy, partly because it felt like the natural continuation of that offering, and partly because he needed to know what he was capable of in a world larger than Astoria. He had become a SEAL and had served for 22 years, and the chest of commendations he had accumulated over those years included things his mother had never seen in person because she had died in a hospital in Astoria in the 3rd week of his final deployment, and he had not made it home in time, and the promise he had made her, spoken in Vietnamese on a phone call 8 months before, that he would bring his service ribbons home and lay them on the kitchen table so she could hold each one, had not been kept. The ribbons were in a box in the closet of his rented house on Orcas Island, and he had not opened the box since he packed it. He worked as a boat mechanic on the island, which suited him because engines were honest about what was wrong with them, and the work happened close enough to the water that he could hear it while he worked. And the sound of the water was the thing that had drawn him to an island specifically, rather than some other quiet place. He had chosen Orcas from a map, not knowing anyone there, which some people on the island had found strange, and which Keiko Yamamoto, who had been on Orcas since 1952 and found very few things strange, had found entirely sensible. Keiko was 78 years old and ran the island's general store with the precision of a woman who had been running things precisely for most of her life and saw no reason to change the approach. She was small and deliberate in her movements, with white hair cut simply and eyes that held both warmth and the specific quality of someone who had spent time in a place where warmth was not something the authorities provided. Her family had been sent to the Minidoka internment camp in Idaho when she was 6, and her father had returned to Orcas Island afterward because the island was what he knew, and he had decided that belonging to a place was not something another person's fear could permanently revoke. Keiko had grown up with that decision as a kind of inheritance, and it had given her a way of understanding people who were figuring out where they belonged that had nothing to do with where they were from or how long they had been there. She had stocked the specific brand of Vietnamese coffee Vincent's mother had used when Vincent came in the third month and asked quietly if she carried it, and she had not made anything of this, simply found a supplier and ordered a case because that was the kind of general store she ran, and because she had understood something about the box in the closet without being told about it. They talked on Tuesday mornings when the store was slow, about the island mostly, about the weather and the ferry schedule, and the occasional controversy about the deer population that the council revisited every few years without resolving, and once, for longer than either of them had planned, about what it was like to serve a country that did not always seem sure what to do with you, and whether the serving changed the uncertainty or only added to it. And Keiko had said that in her experience it did both, and that this was not a reason not to do it, but simply the truth of it, and that the country was large and inconsistent and worth the trouble anyway. And Vincent had looked at her for a moment and then agreed, and the agreement felt like something more than a polite response, which Keiko noted and did not pursue because Keiko had learned over 78 years that noting things and not pursuing them was one of the more important skills available. The Newfoundland on the beach was approximately 5 years old, black from nose to tail except for a small white patch at her sternum, and she weighed, when Vincent eventually got her to the island's part-time veterinarian, 130 pounds, which was light for a female Newfoundland in good health, and indicated she had been in the water long enough to have burned through reserves. She had no tags, no microchip, and a rope burn around her chest harness clip that suggested she had been attached to something that had not survived whatever the water had done to it. The Coast Guard, when Vincent called, confirmed a report of an overturned recreational vessel 6 miles offshore the previous evening. The owner located and rescued by another boater with minor hypothermia, the dog listed as unaccounted for. The owner, it emerged, was a man from Seattle who had been sailing alone and had gone into the water when his mast failed in a squall, and the dog had gone in with him, and he had been rescued, and she had not been with him when the other boater reached him, and he had filed a lost animal report from the hospital in Bellingham where he was warming up. Vincent called the number. The man said her name was Tide, which Vincent found so specific to the morning he had found her that he wrote it down twice in the notepad he kept by the marina radio. The owner, whose name was Paul, and who turned out to be a retired schoolteacher from Bellevue with salt and pepper hair and a recovered gratitude for being alive that expressed itself in several very long phone calls, wanted Tide back. This was straightforward and right, and Vincent had expected it, and he arranged for Paul to come to the island on the ferry the following Saturday, and spent the intervening week feeding Tide back to full weight and taking her to the beach each morning at 6, because she went to the water with the purposeful enthusiasm of a dog that considered it her proper element. And the sight of a 130-pound Newfoundland entering the November Pacific with the attitude of someone returning to the office was the most straightforwardly joyful thing Vincent had witnessed in longer than he could accurately calculate. She also had the quality, common in large working dogs that have been thoroughly trained and then given time off from the training, of being interested in everything around her without being agitated by any of it, and she moved through Vincent's week with a calm, assessing presence that the boat shop customers found immediately disarming, and the island's more territorial cats found immediately objectionable. Keiko, when Tide came through the store door on a Tuesday behind Vincent, stood behind the counter and looked at her for a long moment, and then said, in Japanese, something Vincent did not understand but whose warmth was clear, and then said in English that this was a dog who knew her job, which Vincent took as the highest praise Keiko routinely offered. Paul arrived on Saturday, and Tide met him at the ferry dock with the Newfoundland version of restraint, which was to say she knocked him partially sideways with her front paws and pressed her enormous black head against his chest and stayed there while he stood, with both arms around her and his face in her fur. And Vincent stood at a respectful distance and felt something he had been trying to locate for 3 years, which was the satisfaction of a thing completed without having to be the one who completes it. Paul thanked him at length. Vincent said the beach had done most of it. Paul looked at him in the specific way that people look at someone who has just said something that is technically true and substantially incomplete, and said that if he was ever back on the island, he would like to buy him coffee. Vincent said he would like that. Tide did not leave with Paul. This was not the plan, and was not immediately apparent as a plan when it happened. But when the ferry boarding call came, and Paul put Tide's leash on and said, "All right, girl," she sat down on the dock with the physical conviction of a 130-pound animal that has made a decision, and looked at Vincent, and then looked at Paul, and then looked at the ferry, and then looked at Vincent again. Paul said her name twice. She did not move. Paul looked at Vincent and said, "I think she's decided something." Vincent said that was his impression too. Paul stood on the dock for a long moment with the leash in his hand, and then he crouched down and held her big face in both hands, and said something to her quietly that Vincent did not hear, and stood up and unclipped the leash, and said to Vincent that she had always been a better judge of where she was needed than he was, and that he had a younger dog at home who would be happy to have him back, and that Tide's papers and vaccination records would be in the mail by Monday. He walked onto the ferry. Tide watched him go without moving. When the ferry pulled away from the dock, she turned and sat beside Vincent's left boot, and that was the end of the deliberation. The thing Tide did in February, which the island talked about for the rest of the winter, happened on a Saturday afternoon when a kayaker from the mainland miscalculated the tidal currents in the channel west of the island and capsized in water cold enough to give a healthy adult about 20 minutes of useful function. Tide, who had been on the beach with Vincent, went into the water before Vincent had finished processing what he was seeing, covering the distance to the capsized kayak with the powerful, unhurried stroke of a dog bred for exactly this, reached the man in the water and held position beside him, letting him grip her harness and keep his head above the surface. While Vincent launched the inflatable from the beach and reached them, the man went to the mainland hospital with mild hypothermia and a story he was going to be telling for years. The Coast Guard station in Friday Harbor sent a note that said Tide's actions were consistent with trained water rescue behavior and asked, formally, if Vincent had considered registering her as a certified water rescue animal, which he had not, but began looking into that same afternoon. Keiko put a photograph on the store window that someone had taken from the ferry landing. Tide in the water, the kayaker's hands on her harness, Vincent's inflatable closing the distance. And under it she wrote, in her careful hand, "This island takes care of its own," which was true and was also something Keiko had believed long before the photograph existed to prove it. Vincent opened the box in the closet that March. He sat at the kitchen table where his mother would have sat if she had ever come to this island, if the timing had been different, and he laid the ribbons out one by one the way he had promised, touching each one the way his mother had touched the things she valued with her whole hand rather than just her fingers, learning them. Tide lay across his feet under the table with the patient, massive warmth of a dog that has been beside people in the worst moments of the water and knows what staying close is worth. He talked to his mother for a while in Vietnamese, which he had not done since the phone call 8 months before she died, and the kitchen held the sound of it the way kitchens hold things, without judgment, without release. He told her about the island, and about Keiko, and about the ferry that ran, regardless of weather, and about a beach where things arrived from the water that no one had sent. Then he folded the ribbons back into the box and put the box on the shelf, not in the closet this time, but on the shelf where he could see it, and that was the promise kept, finally, 3 years late, in the only way that was still available, and which turned out to be enough. If this story reached you tonight, share it with someone who is still carrying a promise they haven't found the way to keep. Tell us in the comments which moment moved you most and which city you are watching from. And if you can, look into a Newfoundland rescue or a water rescue animal program near you, because the dogs that run toward the water when everyone else is running away from it deserve to be seen. Subscribe to this channel, and we will keep finding these stories.